Good morning, everyone. My thanks again to the organizers and Alvin. It's been a fascinating conference, and I'm honored to take part. I think what I'm offering here is some historical perspective, and I hope that it's interesting to you. I've recently edited the diaries and papers of a man named James G. MacDonald. MacDonald was an American advocate for Jewish refugees before and during the Holocaust. And in 1946, he was one of 6 U.S. members on something called the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry regarding the problems of European Jewry and Palestine. This committee was the brainchild of British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin to outflank Harry Truman, who in July 1945 had called for 100,000 Jewish refugees to be moved to Palestine, as well as the American Jews who Bevin imagined manipulated Truman. Bevin called for a joint committee to study the issue. The U.S. members, if carefully chosen, would come to understand the impossibility of moving more Jews to Palestine. MacDonald, whom the State Department disparaged as, quote, a professional Zionist, unquote, managed to crash this committee. And I can't get into the details of it here, but the committee eventually upset British aims precisely by recommending the 100,000 immigration certificates. Now, in editing MacDonald's papers, I revisited the records of the Anglo-American Committee itself, as well as relevant State Department and Foreign Office material, which had really not been used since the mid-1980s. And a few things occurred to me. This was not the first committee to consider the Jewish question and Palestine, but it was the first to include the U.S., and it was the first to occur after the Holocaust. And its hearings were worldwide, occurring in Washington, London, Western and Central Europe, the Arab capitals, and Jerusalem. The committee thus heard an astonishing range of opinion. Most everyone testified, from Jewish leaders to British colonial and military officials to Jewish DPs to Arab monarchs, ministers, scholars, and activists. The British government, facing new strategic realities in 1946, sought to establish a global anti-Zionist narrative. Though no one denied the Holocaust yet, the British and Arabs minimized it as an ordinary refugee problem while suggesting that much of the problem of Jewish existence lay with the Jews themselves. Arab speakers also argued that their objections were not based on anti-Semitism, which had been discredited by the Nazis, but a principled anti-colonialist objection to Zionism as a racist and expansionist doctrine, this in 1946. The importance of these arguments today is obvious, but in 1946, London hoped that it all would lead the U.S. members to support 2 recommendations. One, that the White Paper of 1939 be maintained and further Jewish immigration prohibited, and 2, that the British would continue the mandate while dismantling the Jewish Agency and the Haganah. British committee members were extremely hard on Jewish witnesses in Washington, London, Europe, and Jerusalem. It was pointless, they argued, for the Jews to whine about the history of the Shoah or argue over the meaning of the Balfour Declaration. Rather, Jewish witnesses had to show how more Jews could be put in Palestine without causing uproar, and why most Jews could simply not return to Poland, Romania, and so on. Thus, in Washington, when Joseph Schwartz of the Joint discussed the recent Krakow pogrom to demonstrate that the Jewish place in Poland was over, British committee chairman Sir John Singleton simply refuted him. History shows, doesn't it, Singleton asked, and I'm quoting, that in every country where there has been persecution, the people have come back, unquote. Even in Poland, after speaking with Adolf Berman, a former Warsaw Ghetto leader, British committee members asked, quote, whether the friction is being caused by returning Jews asking for restitution of their property, unquote. The British also lost patience with Jews who argued that Arabs and Jews could live at peace with one another. In London, Harry Goodman of Agudat Israel asked the committee to consider the whole tragedy of Jewry, and Singleton thundered back, and I quote, "As more Jews have gone or have been put into Palestine, so Arab hostility has increased. Do you really think that if the British withdrew tomorrow and the Jews put large numbers in Palestine, there would be peace?" Unquote. British mandatory and military officials who testified aimed to convince the committee further that Palestine's main problem was Zionism. It was, they said, the Jews who had been responsible for all of Palestine's troubles. And it was the Jews now who sought to manipulate the fate of their brethren in Europe for political gain. General Edward Spears, who had headed Britain's mission to Syria during the war, compared Zionism to Nazism, this while the Nuremberg trial of the major war criminals was going on. Zionist policy in Palestine, he said, and I quote, has many similar features to Nazi philosophy, including the Nazi idea of Lebensraum. Arab testimony was especially interesting. When the committee was first conceived, the idea was to hear Arab League testimony in Cairo and Palestinian Arab testimony in Jerusalem. But additional Arab witnesses were included throughout the hearing to counter what was seen as a Jewish propaganda advantage. Arab speakers voiced minimal understanding of the Jewish plight in Europe, referring to it as a displaced person's problem only, which cannot be used as an excuse to take over an Arab country. They also argued that Jews lived contentedly elsewhere in the Arab world so long as they knew their place, but that these Jews too would suffer for Zionism's arrogance. The only solution was to reject any further Jewish immigration to Palestine. Much of this testimony, though coordinated, drifted into anti-Semitic tropes. Representatives of the Institute for Arab American Affairs, an organization founded in the U.S. in 1944 to counter so-called Jewish propaganda there, testified in Washington. Princeton professor Philip Hitti testified that, quote, political Zionism is the rankest kind of imperialism, unquote. His colleague John Hazam of City College added that the Zionists would make the Holy Land into, I quote, a cross between Pittsburgh and Coney Island, unquote. I think that was meant to be derogatory.
Very accurate.
Yes. Adding that the Zionists, as, quote, shrewd political opportunists, quickly seized upon the refugee problem and exploited it for their own political ends. The Institute's director, Khalil Tota, added that the trouble caused by Zionism, and I quote, has spread just like the plague, just like the measles, and just like any other disease. In February 1946, numerous Arab dignitaries from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon were in London for the opening of the UN General Assembly. The spokesman was Faris al-Khoury of the Syrian parliament, who insisted that the committee's real job was to, quote, find out what is the reason why all Jews over this world are not received agreeably. They are undesirable because they believe they are the chosen people of God and because they keep racism, unquote. The Cairo hearings in March of 1946 were to be more carefully choreographed. Richard Crossman, a British member of the committee, remembered that the Arabs were determined, and I quote, not so much to submit to detailed cross-questioning. Their purpose was to deliver to the committee as a ritual act a statement of the Arab attitude and to make clear to us that this statement could not be modified, unquote. Again, the argument was that the problem lay with the Jews themselves. Abd al-Rahman Azam Pasha, the Secretary General of the Arab League, made what he surely thought was a poetic statement. Our brother, he lamented, has gone to Europe and to the West and come back as something else. A Russified Jew, a Polish Jew, a German Jew, an English Jew. Coming back with imperialistic ideas, with materialistic ideas, with reactionary and revolutionary ideas of all sorts. Habib Bourguiba of Tunisia reiterated that the solution for Europe's Jews was to reform themselves where they were rather than move elsewhere. It is for the Jews, he said, and I quote, to change themselves, to change certain contentions which they hold, which make them offensive to the locality where they live, unquote. Committee members visited other Arab capitals at the behest of the British Foreign Office, which argued that these visits would be more profitable for storing up goodwill in the Arab world than would visits to Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and elsewhere to talk with Jewish communities. In Riyadh, and I'll give just one example, King Abdulaziz ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia was coached on what to say by the U.S. Ambassador William Eddy. I can't get into Eddy here, but yeah, he was a character. The Jews, the king insisted, were enemies, quote, in every country where they can create trouble. MacDonald, along with 2 other committee members, visited Damascus, where a small Jewish delegation, flanked by Syrian police, testified for 45 seconds of their allotted 20 minutes. The Jews in Syria, they said, and I quote, live in peace and prosperity and have no connection with Zionism, unquote. MacDonald later commented that they were truly terrified men. In Beirut, MacDonald's subcommittee visited a ministerial council under Prime Minister Sami al-Sul, and he wrote in his diary later that, quote, the opinions expressed were strongly, sometimes violently anti-Zionist or even anti-Jewish. One of the ministers repeated some of the most fantastic of the Hitler charges against the Jews. And I should note that MacDonald had actually met Hitler in 1933, and Hitler had told him, the rest of the world doesn't know how to get rid of its Jews. I will show the rest of the world how to do it. Yet the climax of the committee's work came in Jerusalem. From the Jewish Agency, the committee heard from Chaim Weizmann, David Ben-Gurion, Moshe Shertak, and Golda Meyerson, all of whom pressed for liberalized immigration, and all of whom predicted that Jews and Arabs would live together in a Jewish state while raising political and economic standards throughout the Middle East. Yet for our purposes, some of the most interesting testimony came from Arab leaders. This is not really the place to go into the state of what one can rightly call mufti studies. But it's an interesting field. I don't know if it's a field really. Matthias has written about it. There's a broad literature on this. And there are a couple of arguments making the rounds these days, promoted by Tom Segev, John Judas, Gilbert Ashkar, and others that seeks to separate the Mufti from his Nazi collaboration, yet while at the same time adopting some of the language of the Nazis themselves. And the argument is sort of that he was a simple anti-colonialist leader who was in Berlin, or his collaboration with the Nazis was purely benign and pragmatic. In any event, he didn't testify in Palestine. As you know, he was in exile in Paris, living under kind of a benign house arrest, but he was very much there in spirit. In Cairo, when speaking to the Anglo-American Committee, Sheikh Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, complained that, quote, this commission has heard the statement of several Zionist leaders, but has not heard the statement of one man who more than anybody else is entitled to speak for Palestine, namely Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem. All of this makes the testimony in Jerusalem of the Mufti's cousin, Jamal al-Husseini, quite interesting. Jamal at the time was the acting chairman of the Arab Higher Committee. The British had arrested him in Iran in 1941, and he spent much of the war in British custody in Rhodesia while the Mufti was in Berlin. The British allowed him to return to Palestine and testify to the committee in 1946. He received a hero's welcome as tens of thousands turned out to cheer him as the surrogate for the Mufti, then opened his testimony with the complaint that the Palestinian Arabs were deprived of, quote, the presence of their first leader, the Mufti, for whom there can be no substitute. You will not, he said, find one person or 0.5% of the population who will object to the Mufti in any way, at least not publicly. He didn't say that part. He explained the Mufti's time in Berlin as pragmatic. The Berlin had chased him until he had nowhere else to go. And in a sense, this is the first sort of revisionist history of the Mufti's period in Berlin. And that in Germany, quote, he has done nothing except work for the good of his nation. Jamal then made a number of interesting observations concerning the Jews. Anti-Semitism, he said, and I quote, is really our calamity. Because had there been no anti-Semitism, the Jews would not have come to Palestine. He compared Ben-Gurion's testimony of 2 days before to hearing Hitler from beyond the grave. And when asked what would happen if the British pulled out of Palestine, he answered obliquely, and I quote, the whole situation will be turned to what it had been before the First World War, unquote. Jamal al-Husseini was not alone. Representatives of the Arab office made the same sorts of arguments. Ahmad al-Shukari, later the first chairman of the PLO, lamented Jewish control of minds in Washington and London through the press, high finance, and so on. Albert Hourani, later a distinguished historian, said there could be no compromise with the Jews. No more could come, and those remaining had to behave as a docile minority or leave. After 3 weeks of arguments in Lausanne, the Anglo-American Committee sidestepped the political settlement for Palestine, but recommended 100,000 immigration certificates. The story of how this recommendation emerged from behind closed doors in Switzerland cannot be recounted here. It's a good story, but I just don't have time. The point to be made is that the recommendation was an extremely deep shock to the British, who thought that all the proper arguments had been made, and it was a deep shock to all Arab leaders who believed that their anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism would carry the day and essentially make it clear that no more Jews could come. Most deeply shocked were Arab leaders. Syrian President Shukri al-Quwatli expressed his anger in private to U.S. Ambassador George Wadsworth, who Quwatli rightly regarded as a political ally. Forgetting all of the earlier carefully worded public distinctions between Jews and Zionists, he said to Wadsworth, and I quote, "We fear the great influence wielded by Jews everywhere, most notably in the United States. And can you not see that while Muslims and Christians can work together, it is abnormal that either should make common cause with the Jews? They have always been troublemakers. Our Quran inveighs against them specifically." And he was a secular guy. The origins of this sort of thinking, and I'll close here, which melded anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism while mingling religious objections to Jews with paranoid European fantasies about Jewish influence, has been written about elsewhere. But Britain's political use of this thinking during the Palestine debate surely did nothing to discredit it. London tried to pull Washington along by promoting rhetoric delegitimizing the issue while demonizing the Jews in general, and it was all the more unfortunate for the fact that it straddled the Holocaust aftermath and the immediate prehistory of the Jewish state. But in closing, I would simply make the point, which I think everybody knows implicitly, that you didn't really need incursions into Gaza. You didn't need an occupation, and you didn't even need a Jewish state for this kind of rhetoric to come to the fore. This was a year and a half before the partition resolution in the UN, and fully 2 years before the birth of a Jewish state. All you really needed was Jews themselves. Thank you.